Hello and welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes. As you know, normally I say in Luxembourg, but this is not the case today because we are expanding and we're looking into European research. And today we are not far away because we're in Switzerland. And we're talking to Mike Schäfer, who is a professor of science communication, head of the Department of Communication and Media Research at the University of Zurich, and the director of CHESS, so Center for Higher Education and Science Studies. Mike, thank you very much for coming today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I am very excited to start with this first question because this is not something I was preparing, but I got an out-of-office message from you and I need to ask about this. So what do you have in your out-of-office message? Do you change it often?
When I'm away, I try to put something funny in my out-of-office message. And this time I was experimenting a little bit. And in the end, it was something like I'm away from the office investigating putative ovipositioning among leopards, which is ovipositioning is the positioning of X. Putative means allegedly, essentially. And leopards are, among other things, rabbits. So it's the investigating the alleged hiding or even laying of eggs among rabbits. That was the message. It took a while to actually find the proper and biologically correct. And maybe there's some listener who can correct me on that, so I'm happy to hear that as well. But that I tried to get the biologically correct way of putting that. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds really great. And I have to say, I did check all the words I did not get to understand what you were trying to tell me. I wonder how many people do that, right? Instead of actually realizing he's out of office. I had some business with him.
I got quite a few people getting back to me. Some of them who should know. And nobody corrected me so far, but yeah, we'll see.
Okay. And how do you get the inspiration then?
That's a difficult question about inspiration often, right? I don't know really. I mean, obviously it was Easter. So it's something Easter related was the topic or what was the task in a way. And that's also often what I try to do. So when I'm going skiing, it's got to be something skiing related. When I go on summer holidays, depending where I go, it should have something to do with that. I don't remember, to be honest.
If you are into science communication, you actually try to avoid the jargon rather than just put it all out. So it's very difficult to switch your brain into the other side of things.
Absolutely. And here it was obviously hiding a rather trivial message under a thick layer of heavy jargon. That was the idea. And I think that worked quite well because I didn't know any of the words. So I had to actually puzzle it together myself. I'm not a biologist by training either.
Yeah, exactly. This is always a problem if you are a science communicator when you're not the person by training, but maybe it's better. If you're communicating about biology, should you be a biologist? What's your opinion?
I think that depends on who you are communicating with, as it often does when you do science communication. On a more serious note, that is part of what I often, or what we, the colleagues I'm working with, also what we often do is try to figure out, well, under what circumstances does science communication achieve its goals? Where does it work, if you like? Where doesn't it work? And part of the big equation that you need to take into account to do that is to look at, well, who's actually my audience? And what do I want to achieve with this audience? Is it dialogue? Is it disseminating knowledge? Is it other things? And the audience, is it scientists or people with a strong affinity and extensive knowledge about science? Or is it other groups of the population, which I would argue are at least as important when we do science communication? We can get to that later. So depending on who you are communicating with, that changes. If you are communicating with a very specialist or very knowledgeable audience, it's certainly good if you are also very knowledgeable. But as a communicator, you have to have several kinds of skills usually. So you have the scientific expertise, or at least a certain degree of that. You also have to have, if you like, a communicative expertise. You have to know, well, how can I explain this? Or how can I initiate a proper and fruitful dialogue with my audience? And that's a skill that is as important as the prior one.
So I eventually asked you about the science communication intermediaries, if you want, right? Because I feel I'm the intermediary. And I have to say that very often when I'm interviewing scientists, they're like, okay, what's your background? So there's that moment of, this rope pulling, as I call it, right? Because they are like, okay, yes, you're a journalist. You're going to ask me questions, but you have no idea. I don't know. There's always that assumption and expectation on the scientist side that I will be an expert. Whereas, as you're saying, that's not necessarily always the main thing if you're thinking of different target audiences.
Yeah, no, I think it's understandable for scientists to look at the relation to an intermediary in that way. But as the intermediary term already suggests, an intermediary has a mediating position between two entities. In the broadest sense here, these are probably science and society, if you like, even though society and science both can be very different things and different types of audiences and scientists, etc., etc. But it's a communicative middle position. And if you are in this middle position, the job often is not and should not be, I would argue, to just take one side. You are not the translator of the scientific side towards a passive and allegedly a little dumber and a little more lay knowledge. That's not the job is also that you are an advocate for an audience. The societal perspective to the equation, you are also looking at scientists in a way, especially if you are a journalist, where it's actually your job, your fourth estate. Your job is partly not to be scientists' friends, I would argue. Your job is not to just translate what scientists do. That's also not what political journalists do with politicians, and they shouldn't. Your job is to look at science and to see, well, what's happening in science that is relevant for society, that society should know about. And the other position, vice versa, essentially, is to say, well, and what would society's positions or society's questions, or maybe even society's concerns, and that can include concerns that from a scientific standpoint may seem not that justified or whatever. It's still valid concerns if people have them, to bring them back and to ask about them and to get an explanation and to enable this dialogue and exchange. Communicators should not just be translators of the one position to the others.
So when you look at the different target audiences in your research, you define them, you name them, and there's the one that I like the most, which are the science files, right? Because also the podcast, one of the taglines of the podcast is that it's a podcast for people who love science or don't yet know that they do. So I really want people to fall in love with science. And first of all, I was wondering, where should the bar be? Okay, because you just mentioned that we should not always assume that people are this low, let's say, on the knowledge scale. So should we try to say, okay, I set the bar higher because I believe in my audience, or should I go out and reach out to them? Should we try to convert everyone to a science file, essentially?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a number of questions, actually. I think, first of all, again, it depends. This is a podcast about science here. And it's about people who like science, which is essentially the group that we, based on our statistical and qualitative analysis, have labeled the science files. People who often have an academic background, who know a lot about science, who inform themselves actively about science, who have a great interest, who consume different kinds of information sources and media in different languages, etc., etc. They're very knowledgeable. And a lot of them will be the audience of this podcast, which is quite common, actually, for many science communication formats. Many science communication formats, either intended or unintended, reach essentially the science file audience, which is good, but which is also in Switzerland. We did a couple of studies on that. It's not quite a quarter of the Swiss population, science file. So it's a small group. And it's a group that, if you like, you could say, well, that's the choir we are preaching to here. That's people who already are on board, who like science, who appreciate science, who know a lot about science. And it's still good, of course, to communicate with them and to inform them of what's going on and to have a certain kind of discussion and dialogue with them. But you also, in your title, have, okay, people who don't quite know yet that they know science, right? And they are also really interesting. So that's groups of people that... Another example from our Swiss studies here is a group that's much bigger than the science files in Switzerland is what we call the passive supporters. And the passive supporters are a group that is not that knowledgeable about science, doesn't have an explicit interest, doesn't seek out also science-related information and science-related topics, and doesn't consume science magazines, etc., but still trusts science and has the impression of, I'm pretty sure what they are doing makes sense and is important and it should be publicly funded. And no, they should do their job. Still, it doesn't maybe have that much to do with me and with my own life. And in some instances that may be true, doesn't have to do much with your life, but in others it may not be true, because science touches your life in various ways. And during the pandemic, we all immediately and suddenly saw that, and it was very important, and that triggered a lot of debate and a lot more people participating in these debates because they knew, okay, it touches me, my kids. Can I vaccinate my kids? What can I do here, etc., etc. So there, it was suddenly there. But there's a lot of technologies that we all use in our lives that are science-based. There's a lot of other things, medical advances, nutrition facts. If I go to the gym, what works, what doesn't? There's a lot of science in our lives. So there are people to be inspired and to motivated and that's the people who don't quite know yet that they are interested or like it. And getting them involved is actually interesting. The passive supporters group in Switzerland, that's 40% of the population. It's much bigger than the science files group. And that's also the group that doesn't go into the university if we have an open day, or that doesn't go to the science fair, that doesn't go to scientific talks usually, etc., etc. So they don't come by themselves. And the task for science communicators should be, I would argue, the science files. It's good to offer them stuff, of course. But there's a lot out there. There's a lot of great, great science communication out there already that the science files can consume and actually do consume and seek out and find. But getting the other groups, reaching them, it's more difficult. You can't just open your door as a university. You actually have to go where they are. You have to seek them out. You have to find ways to tell the story in a way that interests them and that inspires them. That's more difficult, but that's, I would argue, in a way more relevant and a better use of resources, because that's also the group. They haven't reached the ceiling yet in terms of their interest in science and what they think about science. And it's also important, if you want to look at it more critically, to not have them slip away into the realm of disinformation and all the way to conspiracy theories, if you like. So they are really important, I think, to be talked about, to have a dialogue with them, to see what concerns and interests them.
So aiming at passive supporters, not the ones that completely are not interested.
I would argue that is certainly interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Good to know, because I also have to deal with funding sometimes, right? And you need to write all these reasons and who you want to reach and whatever. And I have a feeling that there are certain groups that are easier to put in an application form, let's say, and to convince others. Like, I do tend, from my lay perspective, to see that it's easier to say, okay, we're going to go to schools. Science communication for children, for youngsters. It's just somehow there is this tendency to think that this relevance is higher than reaching out to passive supporters who are adults. I don't know whether there is any data on that, but I have that feeling sometimes.
Yeah, no, but I would agree, actually. I'm not an education scientist. I don't do pedagogical science or something like that. So I don't deal that much with children and adolescents in my research. Many of my research questions, when we do surveys like the Science Barometer Switzerland, where we assess what the Swiss think about science, you have a similar survey in Luxembourg that just came out. We start with essentially 14 or 16 years upwards is typically what we do. And among these groups, then, the passive supporters are an important group, I would argue. Schools are a great place to do it. In schools, you reach everybody if you do it well, if you go to different kinds of schools. Every kid has to go through school. You reach kids with different backgrounds, of different genders, different age groups, different interests, etc. That's a great way to do science communication. And also, of course, because they are still in the formative phase of their life. If you get somebody inspired, if he or she is 12 years old, chances are he or she takes it with him or her for 70 years to go. And that's great if you can do that. So I would not argue that communicating to the passive supporters is more important than going to schools necessarily. The schools are really a great place to do it as well.
Okay, so we looked at the point of view of the intermediaries. So now let's look at the scientists. I have to say that I didn't have a very objective question that I sent to you, because the question I sent was, why don't scientists communicate more? Because that kind of shows what I think about it. But that's exactly what I see. Should they, and why don't they?
I'll start with the research first. I mean, that's essentially also my perspective usually, right? I do research in science communication, so I try to figure out systematically what works, what doesn't, who wants to communicate regarding your question, who doesn't, why don't they, etc. And there's quite a few studies, not actually that many on Switzerland, but there's a little bit on Switzerland, but there's on many other countries. There's a lot of studies on, well, what scientists would like to engage with the public, what scientists would like to communicate, in what ways, on what topics, with what motives and motivations in mind, also with what mental models of how it would work. And if you look at these studies, the recurring theme is quite a few scientists by now think it's an important topic, science communication is. So they think it's important to engage with the public. If you look at that over time, the number is rising. And if you look at that right now, the number among younger scientists is often larger than among older scientists. So there could be a generational change coming, which I would appreciate personally. But if you look at, well, how many of those who say they would like to actually do communicate? The number is much smaller. That has a number of factors that play into that. Partly it's a demand question. It's supply and demand. Supply is the side of the scientists. Demand is the side of intermediaries, for example. Journalists don't seek out junior scientists, for example. Journalists seek out professors, tend to, that's not always the case, but journalists tend to seek out professors, more senior professors, more visible professors, often also professors that they already had in their medium, on their channel, on their show, in their podcast, in their newspaper, whatever it is, because they know, okay, he or she is willing to do that. He or she can talk in a way that's not totally illegible. So the demand is also in a way that it's A, more experienced scientists, and B, more those that already did it. So it's a bit the Matthew effect of those who get given more. If you look at the supply side, the scientists themselves or the scientific system, you see that scientists individually are often uncertain. I'm not quite sure what will journalists ask in the end, and how will they use what I tell them, and can I really rely that they use this in a responsible way, and then they quote me out of context and I get backlash, etc. So that's an issue. They don't quite know, how does it work? If I go on a podcast, what do I have to do? And do you actually send me back my quotes? Can I edit them? Or once I said it, it's out there, and then people will come and criticize me, etc. So that plays a role, the uncertainty. And that's something you can address with training, for example, obviously. And there's a lot of, certainly in Switzerland, but I think in many countries, training in science communication for scientists. That is something that has expanded considerably in recent years. Another factor is time, of course. Many people are pressed for time. They are on temporary positions. They don't have permanent positions. They have to qualify. They have to move on. They have to do their PhDs or the next project, etc., quickly to get on a permanent position or professorship. And that pressure does not help when you take time off to something that is essentially a bit of an extracurricular activity, which immediately leads to the next point. It's an extracurricular activity in the scientific. So it's not really valorized in the scientific system. For many scientists, if they do that, if they go in podcasts, if they write something in media, if they do social, they don't benefit directly and immediately and strongly enough from that scientifically. You do benefit in a way. There are studies, for example, showing that if you have a strong social media profile, you get cited more as a scientist, for good and for bad. But it helps with citations. It helps with if you're into that, with your Hirsch index, etc. It helps also in a way. But usually these are aspects that in many countries are not looked at when scientists get promoted or get a permanent position. That takes away some incentive to actually do it. The fourth reason is the culture that is changing, I feel, but still in some fields or in some groups or in some institutions is a culture of the peers or the superiors, the bosses saying to scientists, well, look, you don't really have to, you don't go on that podcast, do some serious research instead. That's more important, etc., etc. So you don't always get appreciated or incentivized by your peers. And the last thing is, and that we've seen that during the COVID pandemic strongly, and it was also a strong topic in the scientific community of discussion, negative backlash from society. Forces in society have gotten stronger in many societies. We see that in the US very prominently now, but it's not a problem that is only confined to the US, that people who expose themselves, scientists who expose themselves publicly, get negative backlash, especially female colleagues, especially colleagues also in certain fields. If you do climate research, if you do research on gender issues, etc., there's a lot of negative relations that many people also have gotten during the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a couple of higher profile articles in Science and Nature on that, for example, sometimes really ugly stuff. And many colleagues have seen that and know that and are afraid of that. And the system, science, also is not ideally set up to actually help them. To help them socially, to help them psychologically, to help them legally if necessary. Also, universities in many countries are not really set up that if people get death threats, to really help them quickly and in a way that really works. So it's a bouquet of reasons that all contribute to it's fewer scientists communicating that actually would like to.
Of course. And it leads to a quote that I found in one of the articles I read where it was a discussion between different scientists. Actually, you said that facts and truth are losing their role as guiding principles, right? That is very much related. Why is it happening then? Is it the fault of the science communicators, the scientists? What's going on?
No. I mean, science communication can play a role in navigating that and maybe alleviating that a little bit, but it's a much broader societal issue. The quote comes from an interview with some colleagues that I did where we were asked about, essentially it was about the US and about Donald Trump's policies towards science, etc., and especially towards science communication. And the question was, well, are we living in a post-factual society? And I do think that for some, and by now really also prominent forces in some societies, all the way to the White House currently, truth and orientation towards truth and facts is losing its importance as a guiding principle and as essentially a foundational backbone of what we are doing if we communicate about societal issues or political issues. And that is a challenge if people are simply not concerned about whether they say something is true. Because that's one of the axioms that in many contexts we need to rely on to have fruitful discussions about that. And it's not that that's totally gone. So I'm also not a fan of the post-factual society or the post-factual age that we live in per se. But these forces and these positions are gaining in importance and partly strategic. I mean, there's behind this policy of ignoring facts, ignoring the truth or the alleged truth, flooding the communicative zone with shit, as Steve Bannon has called it. There's a strategic approach to political communication behind that is very effective in paralyzing journalists or fact checkers that actually, if you flood the zone with so much deviant mis and disinformation, it's very difficult to get hold of that because you have to fact check so many things. It always takes longer to clean up after it's been put out there. So it's working to a degree as a strategy. And it's not the fault of science communicators, but it's still, it's a good way, it's a good question, I think, to look at ourselves as science communicators, as scientists, as scientific institutions in the scientific system, and to ask ourselves, maybe what have we done wrong? There's certainly some things we have done wrong. What could we do better? That's important questions to always ask ourselves, maybe currently especially.
So for the what could we, I participated in a keynote speech of a science communicator, and the answer was, we flood them as well. Do you agree with that? We should be also just overproducing science communication content? I
would agree to some degree, yes. Science communication has grown in recent years a lot. And in many ways, that's a good thing. But it has grown. It's been something that is appreciated, at least on a symbolic level, by many universities. It's, for some funders even, it's demanded of every scientific project to do something like that, like the German Ministry of Education and Research. The policy is if you get money from them for a research project, you have to have some science communication component on there. Personally, I'm not convinced that's the best policy. I'm not convinced we need more science communication necessarily. We need better one, I think. We need a science communication that's more reflective of its own goals, of its own target groups, that allocates its resources. And I don't only mean financially better. To look, for example, if we go back to our discussion from earlier, well, what's the target group where we can make the most impact, for example? And maybe we should have a look at the passive supporters as a group. And relatedly, what we see in many countries, there's a shift in power between different parties or participants in science communication, which usually is that, and there's more parties to that, but if you look at scientists and science journalists and professional science communicators as a triangle of sorts, we have a situation now that in many countries, science journalism is losing power and importance. Journalism is in an economic crisis in many countries. Subscription numbers are going down. People willing to pay for journalistic content get fewer and fewer. People using journalistic content get fewer and fewer. Ad revenue is going to the big tech companies by now, or a large degree of that. So there's an economic crisis. And that has resulted also in many fields, but also in science journalism, there's fewer science journalists, there's fewer science desks, there's fewer people with a lot of expertise on science-related issues in media houses. But they were and still are important intermediaries with a critical position, with an outside position also of the science system. Like I said earlier, it's their job to also look critically at what happens in science and the developments that we have there, and to criticize them and to point them out, similar to the good things that happen in science, to actually say, well, look, this is a great set of studies that could mean this and that in the field of nutrition, for example. And while journalism is decreasing, professional communicators in universities, in funding institutions, in scientific organizations, that's a sector that has grown considerably in recent years and professionalized and gotten more resources and time. And many of the journalists that don't have jobs in media houses anymore actually now work, if you like, on the other side. They are professional communicators for scientific organizations and universities. So they have much more power, and they do often also a great job. But what they don't have and can't have, it's not their job, it's also difficult governance-wise, they don't have an outside and they don't have a critical perspective towards their own organization and towards the system, if you like. And they have not necessarily also the interests of the system of science in mind. They also have organizational interests in mind, of course. Like here, the University of Zurich and the ETH in Zurich, two great universities standing side by side on top of Zurich. And they have a good relationship, but there's also some kind of healthy competition. And for example, I don't know, when Nobel Prizes are awarded, I mean, if it's one from either university, that's a great thing, obviously. But if it's somebody from Switzerland or somebody where there's a quote needed for Swiss media, you would like your own scientists or your own institution to provide the quote, right? You would like to position your own people because that's the organizational interest. But the scientific view would be, well, who's more competent? Who has more to say? Who has the better quote, actually, not just our quote? And that's baked into these kinds of jobs. It's not baked into the job of a science journalist. And now the balance of power is shifting. Journalists losing, professional communicators winning, scientists, in a way, winning as well, right? So social media, digital media make it much easier for scientists to communicate directly to publics, etc. So there's new opportunities that they have as well. And that's a challenge that's currently happening, partly also because the critical part, the critical voices of science journalists, it's very difficult to replace them and to find a substitute for that. And I mean, there's great podcasts, for example, there's great individual voices in other places, but it's far and in between. You really have to seek them out. And science journalism was a strong force in the broader scientific ecosystem. And if that continues to shrink, I don't see where the replacement will come from. And that is a challenge.
Before we talk more about it, listeners already know that whenever I am very passionate about the discussion, I forget to ask about the pub quiz questions. There's 30 minutes in, more or less, and I haven't asked you to ask the question. So please, listeners, forgive me if you're waiting for that. And I will ask Mike now to ask the question and then the answer, of course, at the end, and we go back to science journalism.
What is the deficit model of science communication? And why is the deficit model often analyzed and assessed rather critically by scientists, by scholars, and by others?
Okay, and as usual, answer only at the end. And now going back to science journalism, because what you said made me think again about these passive supporters as such. I would say that the traditional model of science journalist was that they would write for a newspaper, a general newspaper, and there was a chance that the passive supporter would just open the page and read something about the science, right? So you don't go and seek out. Is it why you're saying that it's so important?
That's one of the main reasons, precisely. Yeah. And that's a general trend in media ecosystems as we have them currently, that the business model of packaging, of pre-selecting and then packaging content across different topics and fields and selling that towards advertisers and towards an audience is struggling currently in the age of digital media. That was the business model of the newspaper, right? There's the science section, there's the political section, the economic section, there's the culture section, etc. You can make the argument, it's okay if it's struggling because people can now seek out precisely what they are looking for. But what it was good at, and what it still is good at to a degree, but it's eroding slowly, is it provides people with information about certain science-related topics and issues and research results, etc., that would not seek it out. That's also true for many of the passive supporters. They read the newspaper, maybe not on paper anymore, as an e-paper or on their smartphone. They watch the news on television, etc. And every now and then a science-related issue comes along and you hear something about gravitational waves or the Higgs boson or the COVID-19 vaccination. Also, that's one of the primary ways, actually, in which the passive supporters get when they get information about science from. And now this is eroding as well. And that really is a challenge. And the other reason why science journalism, or one of the other reasons, there's more, certainly why science journalism is important, is the critical perspective. That it's unique to you because it's an external voice. And they can criticize what's going on in science. And that is important to have. Even if you turn it around, if you look at research on trust and reputation is always something that a third party gives you as an institution, as a university, as the system of science, as an individual scientist. It's not necessarily something that is related to characteristics that you inherently have. It's something that's externally given. And if you say yourself, but look, I'm very trustworthy, I have a lot of expertise and I'm all totally open with you and all that, people tend to be more cautious towards if I say that about myself, and rightly so, because I obviously have a strong self-interest that people trust me. If an additional body, if an additional entity, if a science journalist says, well, look, Schäfer is not quite untrustworthy, that's much better because he or she has an external position and it comes with the weight of certainly more neutrality. And that does help. It's not just a critical perspective of science journalism. You could even argue the system of science needs a strong external voice like science journalism, also for good, to keep its trust, to keep its reputation, etc.
Yes, but then we're coming back exactly to what you said before, the editorial independence and the economic sustainability. And nowadays, they don't go together.
It's very difficult. Yeah, it's very difficult there's models trying to balance the two things you mentioned, right? So editorial independence and economic feasibility. It's challenging. A lot of the new models that we have are philanthropically financed, so financed by foundations like the Science Media Centers in many countries, or the Conversation as a model that has branched out now to 12 or 15 different countries and regions in the world. And they are great models in their own ways. They are philanthropically funded. Then you have public funding, obviously. In many countries, many Middle European countries, we have public service broadcasting, which helps, of course, but which is also under fire in many countries. There's criticism, it's so expensive and it's one-sided. But that is a model where we in Switzerland, for example, still have excellent science journalism, even though it's also somewhat eroding there. We still have great science journalism at the public service broadcasters. And then the question is, well, what else do you find? And what we see is on other topics as well, but also on science journalism, especially in smaller countries, it's difficult to find models that work well financially on the market that focus on science. Then the question is, okay, if that's the case, if the market doesn't solve this for us, what would be other solutions? Do we need public funding? Do we need foundational funding? Can it be other things? Can it be donation-based? But if it's donation-based, does that work over longer periods of time? And does it create enough resources to actually do it? But that's what people are experimenting with currently. And there's not the Holy Grail is not in sight currently.
So I have to ask you, you said that the science journalism in Switzerland is eroding, but it's fine. But what about the petition? There was a petition recently, so not everything is great.
That was about the eroding part of the whole thing.
Exactly. So what was going on?
The background to the petition was that the public service broadcaster in Switzerland had to cut resources. That was like a political mandate. That was not something they decided. So they had to do that. And as part of that, they also decided to cut science journalism, the parts of their science journalism, in a spot where I felt, and several other colleagues felt, well, it's critical there because they have this small team of very good science journalists, 5-6 science journalists, that delivers also into other media, like we talked about, that deliver into the general news formats, for example, where people not with a prior interest in science would encounter science topics. So I thought that's really important. And they wanted to cut into that, and they likely still will cut into that. So I got together with a couple of colleagues, 10 or 11, I don't quite remember, colleagues, and we wrote a petition against that and put this out for signatures publicly, and very quickly got 10,000 signatures there. So there was a lot of support from the scientific system and science communicators, etc. And then we had a conversation with the public service broadcaster and talked about solutions, etc. And there were some things that they promised, okay, we can't really get away from these cuts, but we won't do any more cuts if there's not additional cuts forced upon us from the outside. But if that's not the case, we will leave it untouched now. So I hope that remains, because especially in a system where among commercial media, science journalism is more and more squeezed and sometimes squeezed out, public service broadcasters gain in relative importance, of course. And then if they start cutting, it's even more problematic.
Yes, for sure. I'm thinking about the Luxembourgish model where we don't have science journalists, but that's a different story, right? We need to do something about it. If someone interested is thinking about it, please contact me. We have to maybe start with a petition, but I don't know. I don't know where we're going to get. Anyway, last thing, I don't want to go too much deep in, because if listeners want to know more, there is an amazing podcast that recently went live, Amplifying Research with Chris Pallow, where you talk a lot about AI. So I was thinking, I don't want to double up on it because it's such a good discussion. Just go. We will share the link in the show notes so you can go and listen to that. But we need to talk about AI. As usual, in almost all the science podcasts nowadays, we need to talk about AI, especially because you do research into it as well. So tell us a little bit of where you are on the bridge between real life and AI, or whatever you want to call it, and where you're going.
I think AI is in real life by now. That's where it starts. And that's also why it interests me so much. The game changer is a term I have used all over the place when it comes to AI, in not just, of course, in science communication, but also in science communication, where I think, and we see also there's studies coming up, and we just had a special issue of JCOM, is the Journal of Science Communication, or one of the journals on science communication. We just had a special issue out there on science communication in the age of AI. And if you look at the studies in there, but also similar studies that people have been starting to publish recently, of course, you see that it's changing how professional communicators deal with them. They started up with using them mostly for the purposes that we all like. I'm translating some stuff, I'm dabbling into getting some text generated, etc. And just a year later, you see, okay, it's much more now. It's generating ideas. It's still translating and text, but it's also visuals now. Some people deal with a little bit of video, etc. So it's many more purposes. It's many more ways. It goes much more deeper in the work. You see the same thing among journalists. And there's very interesting research, not just into individual journalists, but also how news organizations can potentially use AI to leverage the strength that it has. So there's studies trying to figure out, well, can we use AI to properly scan and harvest interesting news stories from repositories like Archive, for example, and to figure out very clear, well, there's something interesting. And these could be news angles that you could use on that specific study for this and that outlet. There's people doing great research on that. And of course, if you look at audiences, it changes a lot for audiences itself. So how people are using it and how aware people are also of using it. So if you go to the OpenAI or Google or Anthropic web pages and go to their tools and use their tools there, you know that you are using generative AI. But practically all of us use generative AI and AI in general all the time when we Google things, when we use social media, when we do other things. So in many aspects of us navigating digital media, AI is already baked in there, all the way to, I don't know, the Microsoft packages that some of us may have on their computers. So it's very prominent, and it's a different kind of game changer even than prior communication revolutions like the introduction of personal computers or the first wave of digitalization, etc., because AI has some degree of agency. It's not just a technology that I use. It replies, it communicates, it acts, and it acts often in a way that we don't really know and understand. And sometimes even experts don't really quite know, why did the reply look like that? Why was it generated just like that? And that really is interesting as a topic to do research on.
I experiment a lot with it, and I love the fact that it can just give me this target audience hat, right? Because it's normally, as a communicator, even if you kind of define the audience, you tend to communicate as if you were talking to yourself, right? Because you have certain presumptions, but you still stay within your bubble. Whereas here you can really, for pitching, for discussion, you can really have that other side, maybe a bit simplified sometimes. Of course, you need to keep improving and prompting, but still that is great. But my problem with it is that there are way too many communicators that just treat it as good enough. right? People who are maybe not as language experts, they just generate something with one prompt and so, well, it can go, right? And we're just flooded by this type of communication that is always delving into things. And I don't know, there are just a few words that I already know clearly that it was very much one prompt generated. Do you think this will change, or we will be just settling for that type of communication?
That's a good question. I don't know if it will change, actually. In the field of science communication, I think AI literacy obviously will become a more important skill to have if you are a communicator. For a long time, it will need humans in the loop still. So I'm not sure if science communicators per se will not be made redundant by AI. Not anytime soon, I think. But what the job looks like will change. And if you are a science communicator who does not keep up with the AI part of it, you may lose your job to somebody who does. So that's going to be a shift, I think. And then, as you say, if you do it well, it can be a really helpful tool, but it's a helpful tool. It's not a solution to everything. And certainly not if you do one-shot applications, if you essentially use it in a way where you don't check, where you don't reprompt, where you don't have an iterative process that adapts it better to what you actually want to and or to your target audience. That's important to do. And I think part of that process, but that's actually, I don't know any research on that or something, but my hope would be, and actually my impression, at least to a degree, is also, well, people will also develop the ability, don't want to call it sense. I think it will actually be more of an ability to figure out, well, what's AI generated bullshit and what's something where there's a little more substance behind it. Maybe not for all texts, but for texts you really care about and that you really engage with. People will be able to distinguish that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that in the good text, there will be AI in many things, starting, there already is, and there will be more, of course. But it will be used in a way that actually makes them better texts than before. Because, as you say, it really can help to adapt your content to audiences that you are not that familiar with. And it's obviously many communicators, me included, if I go out there, I'm not quite sure what very young audiences or different kinds of audiences in some Swiss region I have never been to, what the expectations are there necessarily. And AI can help with some of these questions, certainly. But it needs to be curated. It needs to be properly checked, and it needs to have competent communicators, competent humans in the loop, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And we could go on and on because, of course, I think of those researchers who want to enter the field right now to communicate about them. Where do they start and all this? But I think we will have to meet once again. There's not enough time for all this because we need to solve the pub quiz questions.
I think what I usually tell people who start is, when it comes to AI, certainly, do try it out. And do try it out with some perseverance. So stick with it and try it for different things. Ethan Mollick is an economics professor from the University of Pennsylvania. There
should be the book somewhere there, Co-Intelligence.
There you go. Yeah, I also have it somewhere there. It's and he does a lot on AI and also on AI in at least educational and sometimes even science context. And he has these 4 principles in his book. And one of them is always invite AI to the table. I like that. And meaning, no matter what you do, try what AI can do here, how it can help you here, and use it as an assistant, essentially. He writes this better than I can paraphrase it now, but he essentially, it's like a junior assistant, right? It needs a lot of guidance. It needs to be told, well, what's the context here and what's your role here and what's the expectation that I have towards you here. But if you define that well and iterate this a couple of times, you can really get great results in many fields. You will also realize the fields where, okay, here it really is not helpful. Or it may be helpful in the end, but I can do this in 20% of the time, so it doesn't make sense to actually use it. So use it, be persistent, stick with it for a while. And look for sources that, like the Mollick one, there's others. There's really helpful content out there. Also, I get a lot of that on social media through LinkedIn and Substack and other sources. There's a lot of helpful stuff out there. Try to stay up to date because that will be a core skill for science communicators.
And as you say, keep trying, because I had a discussion with Dr. Mila Marinova about numbers and numerical cognition of AI. And she said, it is a little bit like a small child when it comes to counting. And then actually, once the podcast went live, we realized that it's just changed and it's actually way better right now. So it's amazing. It's just how you log in next week and already there is something more to it.
That's also one of the other principles of Moloch is assume this is the worst AI you will ever use. It's only going to get better.
Exactly.
And it is.
It is. All right. So we leave the AI topic and go back to the pub quiz question. So the deficit model, right? You asked about it. Tell us a little bit more.
The deficit model. That's the oldest, probably, model of science communication. It's also a mental model that scientists often have in their mind when they do science communication. The idea is, that's why it's deficit model, where there's this audience in front of me and the audience has a knowledge deficit, in essence. They don't know as much, it's lay people, they don't know as much as me, etc., etc. So I will educate them. I will tell them about the science and the research and its findings. And once I have improved or actually once I have narrowed this deficit down, their attitudes towards science will magically improve. They will trust me, they will like me, they will have more interest, etc., etc. And it's understandable that many scientists think that way, that because that's the way science and science education, etc., often works. But empirically, we have decades of research now saying, well, it's not that it doesn't work, but it works for a small portion of the population, and many others you just can't interest with this kind of communication. You have to interest them with different kinds of science communication. And for many issues also, what they think may be important. For many issues also, they may have some kind of expertise that matters and that is because it's context specific and local. And so that needs to be taken into account. It's not that they are just dumb and don't know anything. It should be a mutual communication process. And that's some of the reasons why many colleagues have strongly criticized, let's say, the deficit model.
And just what remains is to say, scientists, you keep talking about research in your field and whatever. If you do science communication, look into the research into science communication. You should be using that as well, because there is, as you said, years of knowledge that you can apply to do it right.
Absolutely. If you expect people to be interested in your research because it's research, do look at research on science communication while doing it, because there's research on that as well. Yes.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Mike, for today.
Pleasure, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
And this is it for today. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us, the usual social media thing. We are present everywhere, almost there. We are writing. You can always suggest new guests. And remember, we're expanding, which means that we're also on Patreon. So if you want to support us, please do. And this was SciLux, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.